The scent of manure and rotting flesh filled the nostrils of those present on that morning in 1347. In the central square of York, hundreds of starving peasants gathered in concentric circles, watching in religious silence a scene they never imagined they would witness. At the center of the spectacle, a middle-aged man carried heavy wooden trays, staggering under the weight of the food he himself had denied these people. His fine linen clothes had been replaced by a torn brown tunic, identical to those worn by the poorest servants on his estate. Beside him, a woman with long golden hair knelt before dirty, calloused feet, cleaning them with locks of her own hair. It was Lady Anne, wife of Earl John of York, performing the most degrading task a noblewoman could execute. This was only the first day of a punishment that would last for 2 more, turning the absolute rulers of these lands into servants of their own subjects. If this kind of story deserves to be remembered, support this project by subscribing to the channel and leaving your comment on how justice can take the most extreme forms. The Earldom of York had, until then, represented everything that was most absolute and untouchable about feudal power. John of York controlled over 15,000 acres of fertile land, dozens of villages, and the fate of approximately 8,000 souls. His lineage traced back to the Norman conquerors, and his word had been unquestionable law in those lands for over 3 generations. The family castle stood imposing on a hill, with towers that touched the clouds and walls that seemed indestructible. Lady Anne, his wife, was descended from French nobility and was known for her beauty and refined education. Together, they represented the most privileged elite of a rigidly hierarchical society. The wealth of the York family was based on the systematic exploitation of the peasants who worked their lands. Taxes were collected 3 times a year, always at strategic moments that ensured maximum profit for the lords. During harvest periods, when the workers finally had something to eat, the collectors would arrive with their demands. Grains, animals, fabrics, coins, anything that could be converted into wealth was torn from the peasant families. The system functioned like a perfect machine for concentrating wealth, where each peasant essentially worked to maintain the luxury of a single noble family. The winter of 1346 brought with it a devastating famine that ravaged much of England. The harvests had been poor for 2 consecutive years, and grain stocks were quickly depleted. While the peasants began to die of starvation, Earl John kept his granaries full of wheat, barley, and oats. These reserves were not intended for immediate consumption, but for the lucrative trade he planned to conduct with other earldoms less affected by the famine. It was a cold and calculating economic strategy that turned human suffering into an opportunity for profit. During the cruelest months of that winter, children began to appear dead on the roads, their small bellies swollen from hunger. Entire families abandoned their homes in search of anything edible, from rotten roots to tree bark. Pregnant women lost their babies, and strong men withered away into walking skeletons. Meanwhile, in York Castle, sumptuous banquets took place every night, with tables laden with roasted meat, fresh bread, and imported wine. The contrast between the abundance of the lords and the misery of their subjects reached obscene levels. The peasants' first attempt to ask for help occurred in January 1347. A delegation of village elders went to the castle, hoping to move the earl with accounts of the multiplying deaths. John received them in his main hall, seated on his ornate throne, listening to their pleas with visible irritation. His response was direct and cruel. The peasants should work more and complain less. If they had no food, it was because they were not productive enough. The audience ended with the petitioners being thrown out by the guards, while the earl returned to his warm dinner. It was in this context of total desperation that the most audacious plan those lands had ever witnessed was born. Robert, the main village's blacksmith, was not just a skilled artisan, he was also a man who could read and write, rare skills among peasants. For years he had observed the movements of the castle guards, studied patrol schedules, and mentally mapped every entrance and exit of the fortress. His workshop, located near the earl's stables, gave him a privileged view of the nobility's daily routines. Robert's plan was as simple as it was bold: invade the granaries during the night guard change and distribute the grain among the neediest families. He discreetly recruited 12 trusted men, all fathers who had lost children to the famine. The group included carpenters, shepherds, and farmers, ordinary people who had never questioned feudal authority but who now had nothing left to lose. They spent weeks studying every detail, from the least guarded paths to the best times for the operation. The invasion took place on a moonless night in February 1347. The 13 men managed to penetrate the granaries undetected, carrying sacks of grain in absolute silence. For 3 hours, they transported hundreds of pounds of wheat and barley, distributing everything among the most desperate families in the region. For many children, those grains represented the first substantial meal in months. The plan seemed to have worked perfectly, and for a few days, Robert and his companions believed they had achieved the impossible. The discovery of the theft occurred when the granary administrator, a man named Marcus, made his routine weekly inspection. The deficit was impossible to hide. Tons of grain had simply disappeared overnight. Marcus ran to the castle to report the incident, finding Earl John in his private office, reviewing the estate's accounting books. The nobleman's reaction was explosive. He smashed a solid oak table with his fist, shouted contradictory orders to his guards, and swore terrible revenge against those responsible. The investigation that followed was meticulous and brutal. John summoned an investigator specializing in crimes against the nobility, a man known simply as the Inquisitor. This dark character had developed interrogation methods that could extract confessions from the most resistant suspects. He arrived in the earldom accompanied by assistants and torture instruments, setting himself up in a castle tower that soon became synonymous with terror for the entire local population. The Inquisitor began his work by systematically interrogating all peasants who had access to the castle's vicinity. Servants, artisans, merchants, no one escaped the intimidating questioning. He used refined psychological techniques, promising rewards for those who provided information and threatening terrible punishments for those who lied. Gradually, small details began to emerge. Someone had seen shadows near the granaries, another had heard strange noises during the night. A third had noticed unusual movement near the blacksmith's workshop. Robert realized his capture was a matter of time when he began to notice suspicious glances directed his way. Neighbors, who had cordially greeted him for decades, now averted their eyes when he passed. His wife, Eleanor, a perceptive woman who knew her husband better than anyone, began to ask direct questions about the nights he came home late. The psychological pressure mounted each day, and Robert knew that eventually someone would talk. The final confession came from an unexpected source. Peter, one of the 12 men involved in the theft, had a 17-year-old daughter named Agnes. The Inquisitor, demonstrating his characteristic cruelty, threatened to torture the young woman if Peter did not cooperate with the investigation. Faced with the possibility of seeing his daughter suffer, the man broke under pressure and revealed all the details of the operation. Names, methods, motivations, everything was exposed in a devastating confession that sealed the fate of those involved. Robert's arrest took place on a March morning as he worked quietly in his workshop. 20 armed guards stormed the place, apprehending the blacksmith without any resistance. His companions were captured in the following hours in a coordinated operation that swept the entire region. In less than a day, the 13 men were imprisoned in the castle dungeons, awaiting a trial whose outcome was already determined before it even began. The trial was a carefully orchestrated farce. John of York presided over the proceedings personally, acting simultaneously as judge, jury, and prosecutor. The defendants were charged with theft, treason, and conspiracy against the established feudal order. Robert, as the leader of the group, received additional charges of sedition and corruption of Christian morals. The evidence presented included confessions obtained under torture and the testimony of informants who had been bought or intimidated. The defense of the accused was practically non-existent. The court-appointed lawyer, a young cleric with no experience, limited himself to pleading for mercy based on the extreme circumstances of the famine. He timidly argued that the men had acted out of desperation, not malice, and that their families were literally dying of starvation. These arguments were dismissed with contempt by John, who declared that necessity never justified crimes against noble property. The sentence pronounced by the Earl was calculated to serve as a terrifying example for the entire population. Robert would be publicly hanged, his property confiscated, and his family banished from the lands of York forever. His 12 companions would receive various punishments, from public flogging to the amputation of limbs, but the cruelest penalty was reserved for John himself and his wife, a humiliation that would completely invert the established social hierarchy. The specific punishment intended for the noble couple was born from the twisted mind of the Inquisitor, who suggested an educational punishment that would force the lords to personally experience the condition of their subjects. John and Anne would be required to serve a banquet to the very peasants they had let starve. For 3 consecutive days, they would act as servants to their own servants, in a theatrical reversal of the social order that would shock the entire kingdom. The news of the punishment spread like wildfire through the neighboring villages. For the first time in the history of that region, nobles of royal blood would be forced to publicly submit to their subjects. Messengers on horseback carried the news to the most distant earldoms, and people began to travel from afar to witness the extraordinary spectacle. The central square of York became a pilgrimage point for peasants, merchants, and even some curious nobles. Preparations for the Feast of Shame began a week before the scheduled date. Carpenters built tables and benches to accommodate hundreds of guests. Cooks worked day and night preparing enormous quantities of food, ironically, using the same grain that had been stolen from the Earl's granaries. The menu included roasted meats, fresh breads, nutritious soups, and strong ale, a feast that contrasted dramatically with the hunger those people had faced in the preceding months. Lady Anne spent the last days before the punishment locked in her chambers, refusing to eat or receive visitors. Her servants reported that she spent hours in front of the mirror, cutting locks of her golden hair in a desperate attempt to reduce the humiliation that awaited her. John, for his part, alternated between uncontrollable fits of rage and periods of deep depression. He even tried to bribe the guards to facilitate his escape, but found that his own wealth had lost all persuasive power. The morning of the first day arrived with an unprecedented crowd. More than 1,000 people thronged the square, creating a sea of anxious and expectant faces. Peasants who had never left their villages traveled leagues to witness the event. Merchants closed their shops, artisans abandoned their workshops, and even some clerics left their churches to witness this unique subversion of the established social order. When John and Anne emerged from the castle escorted by guards, an absolute silence fell over the crowd. The visual contrast was devastating. Where once a proud earl walked in velvet and silk, now a humbled man shuffled in servant's clothes. Anne, who for decades had been the personification of female elegance, now looked like a common peasant in her simple brown tunic. Her hair, once styled in elaborate constructions of vanity, fell loose and disheveled around a face marked by weeping. The banquet began with a grotesque ceremony where the new servants were formally presented to their temporary lords. Robert, still awaiting his execution, was brought from the dungeons to symbolically preside over the meal. Chained but maintaining his dignity, the blacksmith watched in silence as the man who had condemned him to death now bowed before him carrying a tray of food. The first few hours were marked by a general atmosphere of disbelief. Many peasants seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation, not knowing how to react to the complete reversal of social roles. Some initially refused to be served by the earl, but gradually, the accumulated hunger of months overcame any moral embarrassment. John staggered under the weight of the trays, his hands, unaccustomed to physical labor, beginning to form painful blisters. Anne faced an even deeper humiliation. Kneeling before dirty, calloused feet, wiping away accumulated grime with her own hair, each gesture represented the complete destruction of everything she had been taught to value. Her tears mixed with the dirt on the ground, creating small pools of mud that further stained her appearance. The peasants, initially embarrassed, gradually began to extend their feet with more confidence, some even smiling at the inversion of power. The second day brought an even crueler dynamic. The novelty had worn off, and the crowd now demanded greater entertainment. Joking comments began to echo through the square, with people making fun of the incompetence of the new servants. John dropped an entire tray of food and was forced to clean up the mess with his own hands, while hundreds of people laughed at his ineptitude. Anne, with her knees bleeding from so much kneeling, continued her degrading task as more people arrived to watch the spectacle. The psychological tension of the nobles reached extreme levels during that second day. John began to show signs of a mental breakdown, talking to himself and occasionally erupting in fits of rage that only intensified the humiliation. Anne developed a constant tremor in her hands, and her nails, once carefully manicured, were now broken and dirty from work. The couple who for decades had ruled those lands with an iron fist was now publicly disintegrating before their subjects. As the third and final day approached, it became clear that something fundamental had forever changed in the social dynamics of that region. The peasants who had spent generations passively accepting their inferior condition had now tasted power. They had seen their absolute lords reduced to the lowest possible state, and that sight could never be erased from their minds. Feudal authority, based on the idea of the inherent superiority of the nobility, had been publicly unmasked as an artificial and fragile construct. The situation was about to reach its most brutal climax, when humiliation would transform into something even more devastating for the nobles involved. The events that followed would mark not only the end of the punishment, but also the beginning of a new era of relations between lords and serfs in those cursed lands. The third day of the Feast of Shame dawned with a different energy in the air. The crowd had grown even larger, now including nobles from neighboring earldoms, who had arrived during the night to witness the final moments of the humiliation. John of York showed visible signs of physical and mental collapse. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His stooped posture demonstrated the exhaustion of someone who had never done physical labor, and his eyes displayed the emptiness of a man who had completely lost his identity. Anne was even worse, with raw knees, tangled and dirty hair, and a vacant stare that indicated a total disconnection from reality. The most brutal moment arrived when Robert, the blacksmith, who had led the grain theft, was brought from the dungeons to preside over the final banquet. Still in chains, he was placed on a raised chair in the center of the square, symbolically transformed into the temporary lord of this social inversion. The man who would be executed the next day now watched his former oppressors serve food at his feet. The irony of the situation reached almost unbearable levels. The man condemned to death had more dignity than the living nobles. It was in this context that the punishment reached its peak of cruelty. A group of bolder peasants began to make increasingly degrading demands. They forced John to kneel and personally apologize to each family that had lost a loved one during the famine. The Earl, with a choked voice and eyes full of tears, was forced to pronounce the names of the dead children one by one, while their parents watched with a mixture of satisfaction and renewed pain, and faced an even more specific humiliation. The village women, led by the widow of a man who had died of starvation, decided she should personally experience the condition of the poorest peasant women. They forced the countess to carry heavy buckets of dirty water, clean latrines with her bare hands, and eat leftover food scraps from the plates. Each task was performed under the watchful eyes of hundreds of people. turning routine activities into rituals of public degradation. The spectacle took on almost theatrical characteristics when some participants began to stage parodies of noble life. A peasant dressed in rags and a grotesque imitation of John's fine clothes, walking through the square mimicking the Earl's haughty gestures. A woman put withered flowers in her hair and pretended to be Anne, exaggerating her refined mannerisms until they became a ridiculous caricature. The crowd erupted in laughter with each imitation, while the real nobles were forced to watch their personas being publicly shattered. Meanwhile, in other parts of the kingdom, equally brutal punishments were being applied to nobles who had transgressed the moral and social laws of the time. In Florence, in the year 1289, Duchess Isabella of Ravenna faced her own walk of shame. Accused of adultery with 3 different men and of conspiring against her husband, she was sentenced to walk through the busiest streets of the city completely naked, carrying only a lit candle and repeating pleas for forgiveness aloud. The preparation for Isabella's walk had been meticulously planned by the Florentine authorities. The route was designed to pass by the city's most symbolic locations: the main cathedral, the central market, the square where she used to appear at public festivals dressed in her finest clothes. Each point on the route represented a different aspect of her social fall. From the religious sanctity she had profaned, to the commerce she had corrupted with her crimes, to the public spaces where her majestic presence would turn into a spectacle of degradation. The crowd that gathered to witness Isabella's walk surpassed all the authorities' expectations. Merchants closed their shops, artisans abandoned their work, and even people from neighboring cities traveled to witness the spectacular fall of one of the most powerful women in the region. The Duchess, who for years had commanded armies and governed territories, now walked slowly between 2 rows of guards, completely exposed to public scrutiny. The cruelest aspect of Isabella's punishment was not just the physical nakedness, but the social nakedness, the complete removal of all symbols and protections that defined her noble identity. Without her elaborate jewels, her imported dresses, her retinue of servants, she became just another vulnerable woman in a society that offered little protection to those who transgressed established norms. The crowd's shouts, "Whore," "traitor," "demon," echoed through the narrow streets, creating a cacophony of moral judgment that would follow her for the rest of her life. During the walk, merchants and common citizens exacted their own form of popular justice. Rotten eggs, spoiled fruit, animal manure, and organic waste flew towards the Duchess, staining her already humiliated body with nauseating substances. Women, especially outraged by her crimes of adultery, shouted specific insults about her sexual morality, while men made vulgar comments about her exposed body. The candle she carried, symbolizing her supposed penance, was repeatedly extinguished by spit and debris thrown by the crowd. In another corner of medieval Europe, in the county of Westmarch, Baron Edmund faced his own form of poetic justice. Convicted of extorting illegal taxes from widows and orphans, he was chained for 7 consecutive days in a pillory specially built with the gold he had stolen from his victims. The irony of the punishment was not lost on the observers. The precious metal that represented his greed now became the instrument of his humiliation. Edmund's golden pillory became a pilgrimage site for all the families who had been harmed by his extortion. Elderly widows, who had lost their savings to the baron's illegal taxes, walked long distances to spit in his face and recall the names of the children who had died for lack of resources. Orphans who had grown up in extreme poverty because of his corrupt practices now gathered around the pillory, throwing small stones and shouting insults they had held back for years of silent suffering. Each day, Edmund's physical condition visibly deteriorated. The gold, initially bright and impressive, began to lose its luster under the constant action of spit, urine, and excrement that the crowd threw at the prisoner. The Baron himself, forced to remain in the same position for hours, developed deep wounds on his wrists and ankles, where the golden chains cut into his skin. His beard grew wild, his hair became matted, and his body acquired a nauseating odor that mixed with the smell of the accumulated debris around him. On the 5th day of exposure, Edmund began to show signs of mental delirium. He started talking to himself, muttering the names of dead people and asking for forgiveness from imaginary ghosts. Some observers noted that he had begun to converse with rats that approached to eat the food scraps thrown by the crowd. The line between reality and hallucination had blurred for a man who had spent his entire life wielding absolute power over others, and now found himself completely helpless. The most theatrical punishment of all took place in Bohemia in 1156, where Prince Aldrich was subjected to an inverted coronation that mocked all the sacred rituals of the monarchy. Accused of selling fake holy relics and stealing from the royal treasury, he was forced to participate in a grotesque ceremony where beggars and prostitutes crowned him as the king of thieves before a crowd of horrified nobles. The fake ceremony followed all the protocols of a royal coronation, but with each sacred element replaced by its most degrading version possible. Where there should have been a golden crown adorned with precious stones, they placed on his head a structure made of thorns intertwined with dried manure. The royal robe was replaced by smelly rags sewn with animal excrement. The majestic scepter became a dirty stick covered in mud and organic debris. The dignitaries who presided over Aldrich's coronation were carefully selected to maximize the prince's humiliation. An elderly, toothless prostitute acted as the archbishop, pronouncing blasphemous blessings in a grotesque imitation of liturgical Latin. A crippled beggar served as the prime minister, reading a proclamation that listed the great deeds of the new king of thieves. Orphaned children were positioned as royal pages, carrying cushions with treasures made of worthless stones and metals. The banquet that followed the fake coronation reached new levels of theatrical cruelty. Aldrich was forced to sit at a royal table made of rotten planks supported by empty barrels, while distinguished guests, all beggars and social outcasts, enjoyed a feast prepared with food scraps and leftovers collected from the streets. The prince, wearing his crown of thorns and manure, was forced to eat the same spoiled food while the participants made toast after toast to His Majesty. The speeches during the fake banquet followed the traditional format of royal celebrations, but with completely inverted content. Improvised speakers rose to praise the new king's qualities, his skill in deceiving innocent people, his creativity in creating fake relics, his dedication to impoverishing the kingdom to enrich himself. Each compliment drew roars of laughter from the crowd and deepened the prince's humiliation, as he was forced to accept the congratulations with forced smiles. The most bizarre punishment of all happened to Marquis Henri of Savoy in 1203, who was literally equated with animals during his public trial. Accused of bestiality and corrupting Christian morals, he was placed in the same pen as his own pigs, being treated with the exact same dignity as the animals he raised. Bishops and nobles watched for weeks as the man who ruled 3 cities was systematically reduced to the level of livestock. The pen specially built for Henri was a deliberately degrading structure, designed to eliminate any distinction between the marquis and the animals. There was no dry area where he could sleep. The entire structure was muddy and covered with fresh pig waste. There were no utensils for eating. He was forced to stick his face in the food just as the animals did. There was no privacy for physiological needs. Everything happened in the same collective space, observed by guards and curious visitors. Henri's daily routine in the pen exactly followed that of the pigs around him. He woke when the animals woke, ate when they ate, and slept when they slept. The food consisted of organic scraps, vegetable peels, and leftovers that would normally be intended only for animals. His beard grew uncontrollably, his hair became matted with mud and debris, and his skin acquired the same nauseating odor as the pigs that shared his space. Religious dignitaries visited the pen regularly, not to offer spiritual comfort, but to observe divine justice being applied to a sinner. Bishops delivered sermons in front of the pen, using Henri as a living example of the consequences of moral transgression. They pointed to the muddy, animalized man as proof that God severely punished those who corrupted the established natural order. These visits became social events for the religious elite, who arrived in groups to witness the complete degradation of a noble who had defied divine laws. The cruelest aspect of Henri's punishment was its indefinite duration. While other public humiliations had set deadlines, he would remain in the pen until he publicly confessed his sins and asked for forgiveness before the entire community. This confession, however, had to be made from within the pen in the presence of the pigs, in a physical position that eliminated any residual dignity. Weeks passed before the psychological pressure finally broke his resistance. When Henri finally confessed, his physical appearance had completely transformed. His hair was so matted and dirty that it looked like animal fur. His skin was covered in sores and infections caused by constant exposure to moisture and waste. His eyes lost their human expression, acquiring the vacant look of someone who had spent too much time in an animalistic state. The confession he mumbled was almost unintelligible, delivered in a hoarse voice that had lost the authoritarian tone that characterized his former social position. Back in York, the Feast of Shame came to an end, with a ceremony that would forever seal the change in the social hierarchy of those lands. John and Anne were forced to sign documents formally renouncing several feudal privileges, including the right to collect certain taxes and to judge minor crimes. These documents were read aloud to the entire crowd, who applauded each renunciation as a personal victory over decades of oppression. Robert's execution took place the next day, but his death took on completely different characteristics from traditional noble executions. Instead of being treated as a common criminal, he was elevated to the status of a popular martyr. Hundreds of people gathered to witness his final moments, many openly weeping for the loss of the man who had dared to challenge the established order. His last words, directed at John, who watched from his castle window, were, "You can kill my body, but you cannot kill the truth that everyone has seen these past few days." The consequences of the punishments extended far beyond the days of public humiliation. John of York never psychologically recovered from the experience. He developed a pathological obsession with personal security, hiring dozens of additional guards and rarely leaving the castle. His authority over the peasants had been irreversibly compromised, where once his word was enough to command obedience, he now had to constantly resort to physical force to maintain control. Lady Anne became a complete recluse, spending the rest of her life locked in her chambers, refusing to receive visitors or participate in public events. Isabella of Ravenna never managed to rebuild her social standing after the Walk of Shame. Rejected by the Florentine nobility and forever marked by public humiliation, she was eventually exiled to a distant rural estate, where she spent her final years in relative poverty. Her attempts to form new relationships were sabotaged by the reputation that preceded her. No nobleman wanted to be associated with a woman who had been seen naked on the streets by thousands of people. Baron Edmund of Westmarch completely lost his sanity during the 7 days in the Golden Pillory. After being released, he spent years wandering the roads as a beggar, unable to recognize his former properties or recall his noble identity. His lands were confiscated and distributed among the families he had harmed, setting a dangerous precedent for other corrupt nobles. His case became a cautionary tale that circulated among the aristocracy, serving as a warning about the consequences of excessively exploiting one's subjects. Prince Aldrich never again set foot on noble territory after his inverted coronation. The psychological trauma of the experience turned him into a paranoid and unstable man, unable to trust any person or situation. He spent the rest of his life exiled in distant lands, supporting himself with basic manual labor and avoiding any contact with his former social class. His lineage was officially erased from the royal records, as if he had never existed. Henri of Savoy eventually gained his freedom after his confession, but his reputation was forever ruined. The time spent in the pigpen left permanent physical marks: scars, chronic infections, and a persistent odor that no amount of bathing could completely eliminate. More importantly, it left psychological scars that would haunt him forever. He developed phobias related to enclosed spaces and animals, as well as recurring episodes where he seemed to mentally revert to the animalized state he had experienced. These extreme punishments marked a turning point in medieval history, demonstrating that even the most powerful nobility was not completely immune to the consequences of their crimes. They established legal precedents that would be cited for centuries, creating a system where public justice could, in exceptional circumstances, overcome the privileges of birth. Public humiliation became a recognized tool to disarm the power of oppressors, showing that social dignity was a fragile construct that could be demolished through systematic exposure. The stories of these humiliated nobles spread throughout medieval Europe as powerful warnings about the limits of absolute power. They fueled a growing awareness among the common classes that the social hierarchy, however established it seemed, could be questioned and temporarily inverted. This awareness planted seeds that would eventually flourish into broader social movements, contributing to gradual changes in the balance of power between lords and serfs. The psychological impact of these punishments extended far beyond the direct victims, affecting the entire noble class that witnessed the spectacles or heard the stories. Many aristocrats began to moderate their more extreme behaviors, fearing that excesses could result in similar humiliations. This moderating effect, though temporary, created periods where feudal exploitation became marginally less brutal, offering small respites for the peasant populations. The documentation of these punishments by the chroniclers of the time created a historical record that served as a source of inspiration for future generations of social reformers. The detailed descriptions of noble humiliations were preserved in manuscripts that circulated secretly among dissident groups, providing concrete examples of how established power could be challenged. These texts became tools of resistance, demonstrating that even the most absolute authorities had vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Today, as we observe the extreme social inequalities that still persist in many societies, these medieval stories resonate with a disturbing relevance. The power structures that allowed the abuses of medieval earls, duchesses, and barons have evolved, but they have not disappeared completely. They have taken new forms: corporations that exploit workers, politicians who enrich themselves at the expense of the people, economic systems that concentrate wealth while millions go hungry. The methods have changed, but the essence of exploitation remains recognizable. The crucial difference between those times and ours lies in the sophistication of social control mechanisms. Where medieval nobles relied on brute force and direct intimidation, modern powers use subtle propaganda, economic manipulation, and complex legal structures to maintain their privileges. The public humiliations that destroyed John of York and his contemporaries would be almost impossible to replicate in a society where power is more dispersed and better protected by layers of intermediaries and institutions. However, the popular thirst for justice against oppressors remains as intense today as it was in the 13th century. Every corruption scandal that comes to light, every revelation of power abuse, every moment when the powerful are publicly exposed, echoes the same emotions that led those medieval peasants to gather in the squares to witness the fall of their lords. The difference is that today these exposures happen through instant digital media, creating virtual public squares where reputations can be shattered in a matter of hours. Modern technology has created new forms of public pillory through social media, where powerful figures can be subjected to collective humiliations that reach millions of people simultaneously. Although these digital punishments rarely result in physical consequences like those suffered by medieval nobles, they can be equally devastating to careers, reputations, and psychological stability. The speed and reach of these modern humiliations surpass anything those 13th century peasants could have imagined. The deepest lesson from these medieval stories is that no system of power, no matter how entrenched it seems, is completely immune to a moral revolution of the masses when oppression reaches unbearable levels. The earls and duchesses who believed they were untouchable discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that their authority depended on the silent consent of those they governed. When that consent was withdrawn, the entire structure of privilege collapsed in a matter of days. If these stories of extreme justice have touched something deep within you, share this knowledge. The more people know how absolute power has been broken in the past, the better prepared we will be to recognize and confront the abuses that still persist in our modern societies. The memory of these events serves as a permanent reminder that no tyrant is truly invincible when confronted by the collective will of those who refuse to accept oppression.